Hi everyone, this is Eric Bond, the founder of Beat the GMAT, and welcome to another webinar co-hosted by Admit Advantage as well as Beat the GMAT. This session is called The Art of School Fit and Recommendations. And today's presenter is a regular in the Beat the GMAT community, Kofi Kankam. And before I turn over to him, I'd like to introduce Admit Advantage a little bit more, as well as Kofi a little bit more. So when you guys have a chance, go to admitadvantage.com, hopefully after this session, and check out the site. Admit Advantage is one of the top MBA admissions consulting firms right now in this industry. And they have a crazy statistics that I always like to share, that 92% of their clients gain admittance to one of their top 4 schools when they work with an Admit Advantage consultant. So these guys really know what they're talking about. And I think a big reason why they're so effective is they have such strong leadership behind folks like Kofi. Kofi Kankam, you guys might have seen him around the community. He's active in our discussion forums as well as MBA Watch. This is a guy, whenever I introduce him, always makes me feel bad because his pedigree is way too impressive for any one individual. He went to Harvard for his undergraduate degree, has a master's from Harvard Graduate School of Education, as well as an MBA from Wharton. Not only that, he's had some very interesting paths in his career to date. He was a co-founder of a startup, a variety of startups. One was a wireless social networking company, GPS social networking company, educational software company. But ultimately, as Kofi will probably attest, he found his true passion and calling with Admit Advantage because he is a guy who's very passionate of working with clients and people to achieve their dreams in MBA admissions. So Kofi, thank you again for joining us for today's session, and we look forward to hearing about the art of school fit and recommendations from you. So take it away.
Oh, thank you, David. Actually, I was just finishing up an email firing my PR agent and looking to hire you. So, no, thank you. Those are really kind words. I appreciate that. And, I am really excited to be here. My background is varied. I have been in your position, which is part of the reason why we started this company, your being the audience position. It was a long time ago, basically about 10 years ago, but I know you guys feel, I know what you're thinking in terms of some of the issues you're facing and sort of wanting to go to these schools and not knowing how you're going to get in and not really understanding how you're supposed to fit all these pieces together without having done it before and to do it perfectly, it seems like. So today we're going to address school fit, sort of how you should think about deciding what the right school is for you. And we're also going to talk a little bit about your recommendations and hopefully leave a lot of time for Q&A on the back end. Okay? I am Kofi Kankam, one of the co-founders, as mentioned, of Admit Advantage. We'll talk a little bit about the company. Not too many slides. You can go to the website. This is sort of your time to go through, for us to sort of look at the different aspects of schools themselves as well as recommendations. We don't like spending a huge amount of time in the company, but we will talk a little bit about it up front. We'll talk about some of the, the mindset in which you sort of need to approach applying to school. We'll look at sort of some general school selection factors. We'll take a look at sort of how we think about schools and how you might consider thinking about it as well. And then, part 5 will be who can help tell my story and how you can prepare them. Okay? So as mentioned, Admit Advantage is an admissions consulting company. We started mostly with MBA. We're now into law and undergrad. But essentially, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on the MBA. We focus on helping candidates all the way from them saying that they want to go to school to literally them going to school. So in the next few weeks, I live in New York. I'll be going to a couple of going away parties for some of our clients. So it's pretty exciting. We actually have hired some people who went to school and they've graduated and now are some of our consultants, so it's kind of full circle. Our process is very structured. We believe in a very rigorous process in order to help differentiate candidates, especially since a lot of you have very similar jobs and or very similar academic backgrounds. We've been very fortunate in the last couple of years to be able to hire consultants who don't just have great pedigree but are really good people and are also diverse in terms of the types of careers in which they have worked and or are working. So careers like, finance, marketing, government. I always talk about our speechwriter for Joe Biden. I think she needs to work a little bit harder because he's putting his foot in his mouth every day. But that said, we have that kind of diversity, technology, consulting, and also entrepreneurship. We have been really fortunate to get people into a variety of different schools. I would say, to be honest with you, our job is guiding people. Those people that got into the schools, those are really 98% of the credit, if not more, but we've been very fortunate to work with really good people and help polish them. Our performance is really based on, or our company is really based on 3 tenets. Experience. It was mentioned, all of our people are alumni of top tier schools. They've also gone through a really extensive selection process and training. In fact, we're updating our training materials. We've been doing that for the last 4 to 6 weeks. It's going to be even more intense. And most have served on admissions committees, either as alumni interviewers and or second-year interviewers, or as literally admissions officers. We're also exceptionally client-focused. When you guys call in for consultations, the founders, and we're going to do it this year, we're going to do it as long as we can, but one of the 3 founders, we do all the initial consultations. We just feel like it's important to understand our clients. We want to have that representation where we're helping people, and we want our clients to really become our friends and become part of our networks as well. And obviously performance. So all this matters for not if people are not getting into top-tier programs. We've been very fortunate to help people get into these programs at the bottom, as well as a slew of others, including Oxford, Cambridge. I guess LBS is on here, but Hong Kong, University of Science and Technology, etc. So we've been pretty pleased with that. And this year, we're seeing off a whole new crop of people who are on their way to helping them achieve their goals, and it's pretty exciting and rewarding in that sense. Okay. In terms of the founders, we are triplets. We've all worked at Accenture. We're all Wharton guys, class of 04. Eric worked at GE and went to Brown undergrad. I worked at Accenture and Net2Phone and sold a software company like Eric did. And I went to Harvard College, Harvard Grad School of Education for my master's in education, and the Wharton School as well. Eli, comparable background. Rodney Morrison was a guy, he's one of our key advisors. He has been a member of the admissions committee at Wharton and Penn. He worked for Management Leaders for Tomorrow in their number 2 position, and he also was a recruiter at Lehman Brothers as well. Okay, so let's talk about the application mindset a little bit. So this is where we are in this process, and the next slide will give you a little bit more. But first of all, no MBA presentation can occur without chevrons. Chevrons are these 2 things. If you do not know what these are, you are obviously on your way to business school, because every MBA has to use these in a presentation or you lose your MBA. But essentially in the pre-application phase, this is where you basically, you have all are finalizing your decision to go to business school, okay, and or you're preparing to take the GMAT, or you've taken already, and this is where you begin to do school selection. As most of you know, the applications for full-time American programs, which is going to be the focus of the talk tonight, just to an extent, full-time American programs have just released their applications in the last month, and they're going to continue doing so until basically late July. Okay, so here's where we've made our decision to pursue business school. You've taken your GMAT or plan to, and you're also starting to think about what schools may be a good fit for you based on where you can get in, based on basically what's a good match in terms of the training and sort of the networking, et cetera, okay? And then basically in the application phase, this is where basically, in terms of your brand strategy, this is where you begin to think about how your recommenders fit in. And that's kind of the first point. Do not isolate your recommendations from your total application strategy. There are a lot of pieces that need to move in concert, including your essays, letters of recommendation, the non-essay data portion of your application, obviously your essays and your interview. Your recommendations are a piece of that, and they should not be something that you're looking at basically in an isolated manner, okay? So in this phase, when you've moved from the pre-application phase to the application phase, this is where you start to think about what are sort of the leadership characteristics and sort of the overall brand you're trying to express. This is where you begin to think about what are some weaknesses and strengths that have come about or come into play since you've been in university or college. This is where you also start to think about, okay, what are the stories, experiences, and accomplishments that actually will allow me to show these characteristics as opposed to basically just talk about them. And this is also the stage where you begin to identify who your recommenders are, okay? Early focus. So this is just, I put this on here for shock and awe purposes, but really just to give you an idea of kind of where we are in this. So we've talked about some of these things a little bit. So I won't go through the pre-application phase point, but I think you guys sort of see where, at this point, I would say if you're making a push for round one, you really should be transitioning from the pre-application phase to the application process phase. You should be doing that in the month of July. Round two, you probably can look to do that basically by November, mid-November. Okay? In the application process phase, looking at the key focus area at the bottom, this is where, in terms of the recommendation factors, we've talked a little bit about your traits, your branding. So within your brand, you want to do a couple of things. Beyond telling your story, beyond sort of that generic sort of set of words I'm sure you guys have heard, or many of you have heard, what does that mean? And that really means sort of differentiating yourself from your peers, especially those of you that work in big companies where a lot of you will be applying to business school. It's making sure that you're showing career consistency. You're getting promoted. You're consistently performing at the top of your class. And it's also showing depth outside, depth based within your job, but really more importantly, outside of your job. And that's sort of where the Cleveland Airport test, which those of us from Cleveland take great exception to. It took me a while to get over that. But basically, the Cleveland Airport test is where you're asked, or somebody else is asked, would they want to spend a full day with you stuck in the Cleveland Airport, right? And so you can't just be an automaton. You can't just be someone who is really good with numbers and is done well in their job, but is not somebody that your colleague would want to spend time with. Okay? And this is where you also, in the recommendations, want to highlight strengths and mitigate weaknesses. And we blurred out, grayed out the other stuff because that's sort of for the future, but this is firmly where you guys are in basically, the blue zone or the yellow zone. Okay? Let's talk about some of the selection factors. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. So in order to understand, who basically, where you should apply to school, you have to have a pretty good feel for who you are as a person and analyze your background, okay? So the first thing you want to do before you think about your school choices, think about why you want to get an MBA, okay? Why are you going? What are your career goals that absolutely mandate you have an MBA? How's your MBA going to help you? How does an MBA fit into your 5 or 10-step process, okay? And what specifically are you looking to get? Now, most of us that have gone to school, and most of you that are going to school, you're going for a number of reasons, but they may vary in terms of intensity or strain. So you're certainly going for the training. You're going for the credibility, to have sort of that stamp on your background. You're going for the related access, and you're also going for the network, okay? Now, some of you will be going to sort of hide out from the economy. That's not a reason you can bring up, but obviously that's something that we get. But really, you're going for those 4 reasons. You've got to learn you've got to think about prioritizing them and ranking them, because that's going to really impact potentially, what school that you look to go to. So, for example, if you're somebody that went to a really rigorous undergraduate school for business or finance, let's say you went to Wharton undergrad or University of Chicago undergrad and major in economics, you may say, look, I obviously have a lot of the rigorous training. I want to go to a school where the training may not be quite as rigorous, but there's going to be, in terms of like the in-classroom number analysis, discounted cash flows, et cetera, et cetera. You may say that's not important to me. The network is important to me, and being able to sort of say work within, work globally is important. So you may look at a school like, for example, like Harvard Business School, right, where you do a lot of cases, but you're not necessarily going to dig down deeply into sort of running numbers the way you might say University of Chicago. You could be the exact opposite. You may be coming from undergrad, you may be someone that majored in English, and you're saying, look, I want to get into hardcore finance. I want to go someplace where I'm going to basically really work my numbers and be able to come out and do high-level analysis. You might say, therefore, I'm going to shy away from a school that's a little less heavy on that like Kellogg, and I may look at a school that's a little bit more rigorous on that kind of thing, like Chicago or like a Columbia or Wharton. So that's why you need to go through that process, that thought process independently, okay? You need to also think about your MBA targeting strategy. So you got to think about what is your sense of urgency. Do you absolutely need to go now? If you do need to go now, so if you're saying, look, I'm engaged, or I'm married, or I'm 29, 30, or I've got a mortgage, or for whatever reason, I want to take over my family business, and my parents are retiring, then going to school now may be more important than for somebody else who, say, would love to go to school now but could deal with going, say, next year. Now by what I mean is, let's say, I'm saying fall 2013, okay, versus fall 2014 and beyond. So if your desire to go to school is now, then you may include some slightly less selective schools, which may not be ideal for you, but are good enough for you to sort of feel comfortable attending because you have to get an MBA at this point in time. And conversely, if you're saying, no, I don't have to go now, and I'm someone who's really shooting for the stars, then you may say, look, I'm only going to apply to, say, like Harvard, Wharton, Columbia, Stanford, but you've got to manage your expectations. You have to be comfortable with the fact that you may not get in, right? Now, you may not get into any school, but obviously applying to those kinds of schools raises the stakes quite a bit, okay? So you've got to think about your targeting strategy, and that's why this, again, ties in your personal understanding and personal analysis. And then you've got to think about which schools make a good fit for you, which schools make sense for you in the context of, your career focus, sort of, what you're looking to do professionally when you're done, what firms recruit there. You've got to look at potentially rankings. I mean, we all like to pretend that rankings aren't really important. People don't want to talk about that, but it matters, right? It definitely does matter. That should be some kind of factor in your consideration from my perspective and our firm's perspective. Obviously, personal considerations in the context of size. Do you want to go to a school that's very small, like a Dartmouth or like a Yale, or do you want to go to a school that's big, or like a Stanford, or do you want to go to a school that's bigger? Do you want a huge network? Do you want to go to a Wharton? Do you want to go to, a Harvard's a big school. I'm not sort of just focusing on those schools, but I think you guys get the point, right? Rural, urban, learning style, etc. Geography, do you want to sort of, you've got to think about it with regard to being in school, and then afterwards, where does this school play? So you may love Indiana, Kelly, right? You may be a Midwestern or Harvard, but if you want to go work in the West Coast afterwards, it may not make as much sense for you to go to Kelly as opposed to maybe going to like a USC, right, in Southern California. So you've got to sort of take all these personal considerations into account when you pick your school. Now, what I'm saying to you guys, the correlated point is that a school that's great for you may not be a school that's great for somebody that looks just like you on paper. Same type of GPA, same sort of major, same sort of school, but they've got different desires. You guys may have totally different optimal schools, even though you may be able to get into the same schools, right? So you've got to really start to know yourself and make sure that you're making the right decision based on your own goals and your own personal analysis, okay? So in terms of the top 20 schools, now to be honest with you, I'm sort of a mixed bag, because to a certain extent, I feel like the schools are highly similar, really, but they have to differentiate themselves in terms of marketing, right? Because you can't have Georgetown can't come out and say they're just like Indiana, or just like UT Austin, et cetera. But the reality is those schools kind of look for similar candidates, right? So you have to keep in mind that these schools, they are similar, but they do market themselves slightly differently, and they do have slightly different characteristics, such that you want to make sure that you're using the right language when you talk to them, because if not, they're going to potentially think you're not a good fit culturally. So starting at the top, though, where they are sort of shared, they do share characteristics, and they're being sort of exclusive and elusive in terms of getting in. So typically at these schools, and I think those of you who have been on these webinars before heard me say this, 70 to 75% of the applicants are admissible, okay? At top 20, really I would say top 35 to top 50 schools generally, at least 60% of the people that apply are admissible, okay? But only 15% are accepted. So just breaking this down, if you have 20 people that are applying, 14 of them are going to be very good, really good enough to get in, and basically 6 of them are going to be, they're not going to be totally disqualified, all 6, but they're going to have a really hard time getting because they don't have the right grades, GPA, the grades, GMAT, or work experience, right? But of those 14 who are really solid, if you look at the top 20 schools, I'd probably say it's 20%, because Stanford and Harvard and Wharton bring it down a little bit. But even if it's 20 or 25%, let's say it's 25%, literally of those 14, you're literally looking at, 5 of those people getting in. Okay, that's 25% of 20, right? So basically, I realized that it's exceptionally difficult to get into these schools, and so you have to think about that when you're applying. I don't want to say it's a crapshoot or a total roll of dice, but people don't always get in when I feel they should get in, and vice versa. It's weird. Like we see instances. We saw an instance actually this past year, for example, where somebody got into Columbia and Wharton and I think Chicago, and they did not get accepted at UVA. They got waitlisted at UCLA, and I think they got in. I think they got into to Michigan, but they got off the wait list from one of those schools. So generally, what I'm saying is that you have to understand that there is a little bit of chance in this, and that happens because there's so many qualified people applying. Okay. That said, leadership is obviously very important for all these schools. They prefer to see actual leadership. This is sort of kinetic energy versus potential energy for all you sort of science geeks out there. But, especially for foreign candidates or for younger candidates, potential leadership is really the hurdle. And what I mean by that is, in American colleges and universities, leadership is really stressed, okay? Like everyone knows, it's stressed from the high school level, right? Everyone knows that you have to do 10 activities or 5 activities really well, et cetera, et cetera. You find in a lot of foreign countries that we found, from our candidates, it's not stressed as much. So to a certain extent, business schools understand their cultural differences between applicants applying from either different types of schools or different countries, or obviously younger candidates aren't going to have quite as much professional leadership because they haven't been working as long, or they haven't been working at all if they're applying straight from college. Okay. In terms of another shared characteristic, schools have, most schools have global study abroad. They've got, some sort of in the community, in the field, sort of hands-on learning opportunities. Most schools do case studies. Now, UVA and Harvard pretty much do those exclusively, but most schools will do at least 25 to 33% case studies. The other 67% to 75% is going to be constituted by lectures and experiential learning, right? Doing like simulations, etc. Okay. Most business schools offer joint degrees: JD MBA, MD MBA, MED MBA, which is a master's in education. Okay. Most schools have strong leadership clubs, or strong clubs that foster leadership. Most schools will have like a women in business. They'll have a Hispanic Student Association. They'll have a technology. People interested in technology will have a conference or student groups for consulting people or for banking people. So every school is kind of going to have that, right? They're going to have a core curriculum, and most schools now, although there's certain schools like Berkeley or Cornell or Yale, and Harvard actually to a certain extent too, that are leading sort of the initiative in terms of social impact. Most schools have social impact. Most schools have social venture stuff. They realize that's important. You guys have said it's important, and so they're adapting, okay? So while these schools are highly similar across these 3 traits, as mentioned at the top of sort of the slide when I was talking, you have to be careful about how they differentiate themselves, and you have to try to mimic that, okay? So let's take a quick snapshot. Let's look at the schools in a quick snapshot, think about the implications, and then how you generally should be planning around that. And this is crude, but I do think it's important to understand. Okay, so this is sort of our unofficial AA's Admin Advantage unofficial sort of American school rankings. And again, I'm focused on American schools. I'll be glad to take questions on international schools at the back end. But essentially, we think of it, and now if you look at sort of across, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Financial Times, Bloomberg Business Week, U.S. News and Report, the layman on the street, which is represented by my mother, Actually, I think it's her birthday, so I told her I'd do something nice for her. But, my mother, Dr. Cam, right? Most people have like a mix, they think of these schools basically in sort of these general tiers. Now, across these different ranking mechanisms at the bottom, they may change year to year, or they may change within a year. So Financial Times may have a school like Wharton #1, and U.S. News and Report may have it #3. Some of that is basically just a need to sell more magazines. Some of it is a slightly different, ranking mechanism. So generally, when you think of these schools in the top 20, when we think of these schools, we think about in the context of Tier 1 being sort of Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, okay? Schools with very global footprints, alumni who are everywhere in the world, brands that are known everywhere you go. Now, I've been to Singapore, I've been to India, I've been to Ghana, where my parents are from. I've been to all these places, and I can tell you I've met with alumni. I have met with some civic leaders. I've met with business people, and they've all heard of these schools, right, these specific schools. As you start to get to the Tier 1A level, which I consider to be sort of Columbia, Kellogg, Chicago, Tuck, which is at Dartmouth, MIT, Sloan, those schools are known globally, don't get me wrong, but they tend to be a little bit stronger nationally. So I was meeting actually a few weeks ago, for example, with a candidate that we worked with that was at Columbia, an Indian candidate, and he graduated. He was back basically for his one-year anniversary. He was telling me that in India, I think he said there's something like 13 Columbia grads, Columbia Business School grads he's been able to find. Now, Columbia is an awesome school, okay? Fantastic school. But there's something, there is some truth to that, in that these brands in the Tier 1A are not as well known. If you're doing work in Singapore, they're not necessarily going to know, the layman on the street or the business person are not necessarily going to know a bunch of people who've gone to Dartmouth Tuck. Now, that has varying levels of importance, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but it's something you guys should know. And then I consider sort of these next schools the best of the rest, right? This is sort of your, let's say your, let's call it 7 or 8 through 20 or so. These are a little bit more regional. Now, Yale's a little different. Yale's a school which is kind of cool in the sense that because it's Yale, it's got sort of that global brand to an extent. The business school is not as strong as the rest of the schools. This is my opinion, right? In the context of the law school, right, which is perennial #1, the med school, and the college, for example. The business school is much newer, started in the 70s, and basically not quite as strong. But because so there is a regional pull, but it also gets a little bit of national and global because of the fact it's Yale. So it's interesting. We have seen candidates that have gone into, say, literally, we had a guy actually who was debating going to Columbia and Dartmouth versus Yale, because even though those, from my perspective, were stronger schools, especially for what he wanted to do, which was finance, he basically was really considering Yale because he wanted to go back overseas, and he felt that Yale would give him a better leg up. Okay, but the rest of these schools are schools like Berkeley, UCLA, NYU, and my wife went. She's sitting right here, so I have to say that she'll be pissed. Although she doesn't like me categorizing NYU as Tier 1B either, which is going to be a problem for me later. So pray for me. But generally, you've got all these other schools, right? So this is how we generally think of how we tier in terms of Tier 1, Tier 1A, Tier 1B, and then you've got sort of Tier 2, which is sort of your 25 through 50, which includes schools like Notre Dame, basically Maryland, Babson, Vandy. There are a bunch of really good schools at that level. But these are sort of the top tier schools in the top 20, and you're going to have wonderful opportunities going to any of these different schools. But you need to think about things and consider the implications, which is a segue to the next slide. So what? So what are the implications, and what are sort of the real lack of consequences? Okay. So what we found is this. So at the top tier, the higher you are, okay, the higher schools rank, the more global carry you have in the context of the more sort of understanding, the more knowledge of the program, the more sort of general respect, the better chance you have to have people that are placed, globally, the higher school you go. So if you go to a school like Harvard or Stanford or Wharton, you're going to have more of a global carry more of an understanding of your program than if you go to a school like, even like Berkeley, which is an awesome school, or Georgetown, or Tepper, or UT Austin, okay? You also see more maintenance during a recession. I was just talking to B, who's one of the co-founders of Beat the GMAT. I was talking about this a little bit before the presentation. When I was in business school, I ran this big conference, and I was in school basically in 2002 through 2004. I remember running this conference. I remember basically speaking to a recruiter, and they basically were saying, look, we're cutting all the way across the board, but we're basically going to focus a disproportionate amount of cuts in terms of the number of interns we hire. We're going to focus a disproportionate number of those cuts in schools sort of literally, they told me like 8 through 20. We're going to cut out like 70% of the slots we hire. And in schools sort of 1 through 7, right, Harvard through, Harvard basically through sort of, Dartmouth and Kellogg in Chicago, they were only going to cut 30%. Right? So you do see that these brands and these schools tend to be a little bit stronger during sort of tough economic times. You also see, in a related way, that there's more brand consistency over a longer period of time. You don't see as much fluctuation, right? So these schools tend to basically stay near the top over a number of years. If you basically look at like Business Week in the last 15, 20 years, it's all online. You can see that generally sort of the Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, so kind of always in Columbia, well, Columbia's risen, but those 3 schools at the top specifically, they're kind of always in the top 5. And you see some fluctuations in sort of, up and down, a little bit of, sort of undulating pendulum. You see that a little bit with the other schools, but not quite as much with the top tier schools, okay? You do see that the higher a school is, typically the more international in scope it is in terms of sort of its focus, but also its class composition. Usually, it's weird. You really could correlate, to a pretty strong point that the more international a school is, you'll see that typically the higher ranked it is in terms of the number of candidates from a foreign country that they have, or the number of countries represented. Okay. Typically, these schools are, the higher ranked you are, better in competitive industries and a wider range of industries, meaning that all these schools are pretty strong, say, across, consulting or maybe investment banking. But when you start getting to sort of, a little more niche areas, a little more exclusive areas like private equity, for example, you'll see that there typically is a little bit of a drop-off or a little bit of a difference, say, between going to a Columbia versus going to like a I'm trying to think, I don't want to insult any school, but like a Georgetown, right? So both those schools will have a really high number of people that can get jobs at McKinsey, right? But if you're looking at sort of, KKR, if you're looking at Blackstone, and I just picked that industry specifically, you'll find that a disproportionate number of those people, in those fields are from a certain elite level of business school. And it's not fair, but it just is the way it is at this point. And maybe that will change over time, okay? Typically, it's a little bit of a stronger network, and typically, it's easier. You may find it's easier to find funding as an entrepreneur. Now, I firmly believe, so, and sort of just in my career, right, I can be smart in some things, really dumb in other things. I was telling these guys I can't even program my DVR. But I believe that there have been certain opportunities I've had over my friends who actually were smarter but didn't want to take on debt, didn't have the same sort of focus on trying to go to the best school possible. I've had different opportunities, right? I've had doors open. I've had people say, okay, we don't really know this guy, we don't really know his idea, but we're going to give him the benefit that we're going to give this guy a shot to get in the door because he went to sort of Harvard and Wharton. I firmly believe that. I've got friends that, I have a very good friend that went to Miami of Ohio, and I can't remember where he went to business school. I think he went to Emory. Okay, really smart guy. He's probably doing better than I am right now, just generally. But, when he was coming out of school, trying to start a company coming out of Miami of Ohio, he had a hard time getting in front of investors. Okay, because they're like, we've never heard of Miami of Ohio. And the same thing with regard to going to Emory. It's been a little bit more difficult. So you've got to keep that in mind. Okay? But on the other hand, going to a really well-known school, as I say in the last point, it's not everything. You can't eat prestige, okay? So notice nothing that I said here has really been about necessarily getting better training. It's not clear to me that you're going to get better training going to a school 1 through 10 or 1 through 20, besides, as opposed to going to school 21 through 50, okay? I generally think that the cream rises to the top, and I think that over time, your school where you went means much less, and it's more so about what have you done with the opportunities, right? So I know people that have gone to Wharton that are not doing anything great at all. Hopefully no one says about me. And I know people that have gone to lesser schools and are just killing it, knocking it out of the park. So I do believe there's sort of a normalization towards your real level of quality. And frankly, there have been a couple of really big studies about that, asking whether or not people that went to school X actually made more money. Now, obviously, I think Fortune or Forbes last week did something. They said, they took the top schools and they saw that like Harvard people made $3.5 million, I think, over the course of like their career, and Wharton was made 3.47. So you do see some of that, but generally, if you're really good and you go to a school, I think in the top 30, top 40, you can find your niche, or even top 50, you can make it happen, okay? I think it's still really hard to gain entry in this certain position. So meaning you could go to Harvard Business School, you still are going to have a hard time getting into that venture capital company because they're not hiring a lot of people, right? So don't think, we get a lot of people that come to us and say, I want to go to school X so I can get into this field, and I want to get into this field directly after business school, and they don't really have a plan B if they don't get into that field. And that plan B may need to be enacted even if you do get into that school. It probably will have to be enacted. When I was in business school, I remember Sequoia came to our school. I don't even know how they came. Sequoia, the VC from that funded Google and Facebook, kind of one of the leading sort of VC from probably in the world, okay? They literally were hiring 4 people. I don't mean 4 people from Wharton. I mean 4 people nationally across all the schools they were looking at. When I went to their event, there were 300 plus people at Wharton alone that were at this event. So going to these schools does not guarantee you're going to get into these jobs. And as mentioned, you cannot eat prestige, okay? So you still have to do well. If you want to, if you're a really good candidate, you may find that less selective schools are more likely to give you money. And if you're looking to start a company immediately after school, it can make a difference, right? So if you're coming out of school $150,000 less in debt, that can be a big deal in terms of enabling you to start a company immediately after school. Or you can come out of school $150,000 in debt and try to figure out how you're going to build this company immediately. You can't eat that Harvard degree. You know what I mean? It's not, you can't cash it at the bank, okay? So you've got to sort of keep that in mind as well. All right, so get on the ball. I know you guys love this slide. It's amazing. That's sarcasm. So basically, the 3 levels of thinking about this, you really should, from our perspective, think firstly, do I have a shot at getting into these schools? And that's largely going to be, largely going to be sort of, you should ascertain that if you're looking at your grades, your GMAT, and your work experience, right? If your grades are terrible, so if you're looking to get into a top 20 school and you have basically below a 3.0, it's going to be pretty challenging for you to get in. Now, that's not to say you can't get in. If you guys have been to our candidate success stories, you've seen that. Some of our guys have gotten in, and our women have gotten in, but things become much more difficult. Frankly, to be honest with you, the mean at the top 20, 25 schools at the American side is pretty much about a 3.3 if you had to blend it. If you're looking at sort of top 5 schools, you're looking at a 3.5 and above. So even being at a 3.1, 3.1, 3.15, 3.2, you're below the mean if you're applying to sort of to any of these schools. Being 0.15 to 0.2 below the mean, I consider fairly significant. If you did sort of a standard deviation, I won't sort of bore with numbers, but you find that it is significant, okay? So that's the first level of thought when you're thinking of schools. Can I even get into these schools, right? If your GMAT is outstanding, i.e. like you haven't taken it, you don't really know. You could have a 3.6 from Carnegie Mellon Engineering, and you may think, okay, I'm going to apply to like all these awesome schools, Virginia, Duke, Columbia, Harvard. If you get a 600 on your GMAT, you have a problem, okay? Just to be totally candid. So that's the first stage, can you get in? The next stage is, what do you want in your career, okay? And this literally is sequential from our perspective, right? So you've got to think about this in terms of industry. What industry you want to be in? Do you want to be in finance? Do you want to be in energy? Do you want to be in manufacturing? Do you want to be in marketing? Some schools are better at some of those things than others, okay? You've got to think about your role. Are you trying to basically be the chief marketing officer or the CEO of a company, or is sort of maybe more work-life balance more important to you, right? Do you want to be somebody who's an MD at a bank, or do you basically want to be running a company that's funded by a bank, or do you want to start at a small boutique bank and be the CEO of that company, maybe in a firm of like 30 or 40 people, versus being one of 500 managing directors at a big bank, right? You could be in the same industry but have a totally different role. You've got to think about location. So, and we talked this a little bit before, do you want to go to school in the woods, right? And I always pick on Tuck, although I love Tuck. Do you want to go to school in the woods, or do you want to go to school in an urban environment where you can get pistol whipped, like Philadelphia? Kidding. I went to Philadelphia. As long as you have fast shoes, you'll be fine. But seriously, you have to think about those things. And obviously, do you want to change careers? That's what I mean by change. So some schools, if you go to a Columbia, if you go to a Stanford, you'll probably find it a little bit easier to switch careers later. Switch careers because you'll find alumni well positioned in all those different areas. One, and you'll also find that people give you a better benefit of the doubt, saying, well, he's a smart guy or she's a smart woman, even though they haven't done this, they went to Columbia, they went to Stanford, we're going to basically give them a chance to sort of switch, versus if you go to, say, maybe Ohio State, or you go to even like USC, they might say, I don't know. And it's not fair. I'm here to speak truth to you guys. I don't want, I'm not saying this is right, but I'm saying this is what it is, right? And so my belief is you get in the system and then you change the system. But it's really hard to change it from outside. Okay, so you've got to think about that second. So do you have a shot? Then what do I want in my career? And then I think, what do you want in your education? Now I put this third, and maybe it's controversial. I put it third because I feel like it's different than college, right? In the context of you're not going for 40 years, and you're not 17, 18 when you're going. Some of you guys are doing one-year programs. A lot of you are going to be doing 2 years, which is really 18 months. To me, the most important thing being 8 years out of school is what career opportunities I've had. I think that, and I talked to a lot of sort of my friends in various slums from different schools and some of our candidates that I've worked with over the years. That's really the most important thing. So, I believe that at the top 20, 25 level, you guys are strong enough to adapt to pretty much any environment. Obviously, you'd rather go to a school that you love. No question about that. No question. But at the end of the day, 5 to 10 years out, to me the most important thing, if I can share some perspective with you guys, is did I have a shot to get after my dream? Did I have a dream that someone gave me a shot to sort of go after? And that's really what it comes down to. At the end of the day, that's why, to a certain extent, you're going to business school. And so that's the way we put it after. Obviously, the education in terms of the size of the class. Do you want a big or small class? The type of learning. We talked about cases versus cases, experiential learning and lectures, the location, urban, rural, Midwest, South, Northeast, West Coast. Culture is important, number crunching culture, heavily analytical culture versus more of sort of, might be categorized as like Wharton or Chicago versus more of like a general team culture and more of like I don't say a kumbaya culture because that's not fair, but more so where everyone's on the same page, moving together, more team-based, which is considered to be like a Duke or a Tuck or a Kellogg, for example. That stuff's really important. You have to think that through. But this is a hierarchy. Do I have a shot? What I want in my career and what I want in my education. I think that's the way you have to think about it. Okay. Who can help tell my story? So this is basically how I think about it, and I guess I was a little bit bored, so I wanted to make this kind of semi-fun. So basically, the correct sequence is to determine what you need said, and then you determine who needs to say it. Every day when we do these consultations, people ask us, who should write my recommendations? And every day my answer is, think more so about what you need written, and then we'll think about who should write your recommendations. So recommendations are like marriage in reverse, okay? So, by the way, we've got a special anniversary coming up. I won't embarrass Eric, but his anniversary is coming next week, so happy anniversary, Eric. But basically, let's get married. So what I mean by that is, you want to basically unite the story, experiences, and accomplishments with specific leadership characteristics. That's what you want to happen in your recommendation, okay? As well as across your entire application. So you want to think about what are the critical stories and experiences and accomplishments that somebody needs to know to understand my life, and what sort of leadership characteristics do those stories, experiences, and accomplishments sort of demonstrate. Things like being analytical, being a great communicator, being able to make decisions with limited information, being civically or community-minded, et cetera, et cetera. You want to try to marry those two things together. This is a show and a tell, okay? You're marrying those two together, and you want to do it across your 4 to 5 platforms. Those platforms being your essays, your resume, your interview if you get it, the non-essay data portion of your application, and obviously your recommendations. All these things need to be moving in concert, okay? Assess to impress. What I mean by that is you need to analyze your strengths and your weaknesses. So again, this is talking about what you need written before we're talking about who's going to write it. This is how you assess what you need to, this is basically how we go through how you formulate your recommendations, right? So let's get married, assess to impress in terms of, determine, your strengths and weaknesses, and then determine of those stories, which of those stories, experiences, and accomplishments help address, those weaknesses and help really showcase those strengths, okay? So it'll help you figure out where the gaps are in your application between those other 4 platforms outside of your recommendation. So between your essays, your resume, your non-essay data portion of your application, those are the 3 things typically that you have to submit in addition to your recommendation before you get an interview. So look at those 3 initial items and figure out where the weaknesses are and where can a recommendation fill that gap. But you've got to assess it first, okay? And then the third point is start how you want to finish. So all of you are most of you are probably going to try to get recommendations from people at work. Well, you have to demonstrate that you are a hitter, you are a young gun, you are somebody that's doing well. You have to demonstrate that early in your career. You don't want to just basically be doing that in the 3 to 6 months before you realize you need a recommendation, because recommenders hate that, and you'll either get somebody saying they're not going to write your recommendation, or worse yet, they'll write your recommendation and it won't be effusive and praiseworthy, okay? So if you want to be seen as a second coming, come correct the first time. Okay, that's what I mean. So if you want to be seen as someone who's a fantastic person that deserves a recommendation, you have to basically be doing well from your job at jump. So if you read these things in reverse order, because we're so clever, start how you want to finish, right, in terms of a relationship, assess yourself to impress your partner, and then you can finally get married. And that's why it's like marriage in reverse. Okay? All right. So be presidential. Okay, in terms of communication. Communicate and trust but verify. By the way, if somebody can tell me what president popularized that term, trust but verify, I will give them a discount above the discount I'm going to offer you guys at the end. The first person to tell us that. First person to write that. Okay, no one's writing that. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Sorry, that was my trivia thing. I was hoping you guys I'm really into history. But basically, what I mean by that is, in terms of these 3 bullet points, bullets and coffee are a great combination, okay? I don't mean that you want to shoot someone and drink a cup of coffee. What I mean by that is you want to give your recommender, basically, bullet points on the experiences and accomplishments and traits that he or she should cover, and then basically you want to sort of meet with them and review those bullet points, okay? And it is Ronald Reagan. That is correct. It is Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, who made that trust but verify. He was talking with Gorbachev and sort of they were doing nuclear disarmament. But anyway, it's really important basically to give bullet points to your recommenders, let them know kind of generally what you want them to focus on. Be brief. We've seen people give basically, pages and pages of like recommendation stuff to the recommender. They're not going to read that. So keep it short, keep it within a page, give it to them, and then schedule a 30-minute cup of coffee or 20-minute cup of coffee to review with them. They should be fine, okay? Never lead from behind, and this is a presidential stuff. That's why we're talking about this kind of stuff, okay? So speak to your recommenders early. If you are in a big company, okay, do not wait for to reach out to your recommenders. If you're applying this fall, do not wait to August or September. Begin to talk to them now, especially the people that you trust that are going to write your recommendations, because people travel, people will be gone over the summer, and people get really busy in the fall when they're trying to hit their fourth quarter numbers. Every year, we literally have somebody crying, male and female, on our phone because they're afraid a recommender is not going to get a recommendation in on time because they waited too long. Okay, so don't do that. Also, do not let them start writing the recommendations before you give them bullets and coffee, because you will find sometimes that it's very hard to change. So you want to give them that up front, and then you basically want to let them do that stuff. Okay? And then obviously you want to find out if they have any issues or challenges with you before you go to them. Trust but verify, we've talked about that a little bit, but generally you want to set the expectation that you would like to see the recommendation before they submit it. Now, there is obviously, the schools ask for a way, but I can tell you all the time, even when candidates waive that right to see the recommendation, the final recommendation, I can tell you that 85% of our candidates see the recommendations before they're submitted. And the reason they were able to do that is because they told the recommender, and they set it up such that they would get a chance to look at. They told them that, hey, look, I want to see the recommendation to make sure it kind of fits in with everything else. I want to make sure I'm writing the right kinds of essays. I want to make sure that I tailor my resume correctly. So they find a reason to get a chance to look at their recommendation, and it helps immensely. We being our company, but also the candidates, we've saved a lot of kind of subtly off-kilter recommendations are being submitted by getting a chance to see them up front. Okay? All right. So I'm not going to talk about this because I do want to get to questions. We have a number of service offerings. Our school packages start at $3,600. We've got hourly, minimum 1 hour. By the way, our packages, both the full service packages and the final review, they're spaced out payments over half up front and half in a month. Where need be, we do a third, a third, and a third over 2 months. Okay, so we try to work with you guys. There is a 10% discount, 1908. If there's somebody that answered this first, and I'm sure Eric will let me know, we will give them a 15% discount if they were able to guess Ronald Reagan. Okay, so I will look at that. Whoever did it first will get that 15% discount. The rest of you will have to settle for only a 10% discount. So 1908 is the 10% discount. Okay. We've got Ding analysis. If you did not get in last year and you want us to look, we will look. And then we've got a pre-application package. So if you're not applying this year or you're going to apply in round 2, that may make sense for you. All this stuff is on our website. Coming up, 15% discount TPR. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and our blog. We've got another webinar tomorrow, MBA application success, and a bunch of them, cracking HBS, non-traditional applicants, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all on our website. Limited viewing. We're going to try to cap it at 100. And sign up for a consultation at SketchMe, sketch.me/adminadvantage. And just like always, Eric Bond, I always finish at 9. I'm sorry. I thought it was going to be shorter, but I'm done.
Well, not a problem, Kofi. We've actually learned from previous experience to build in more time for presentations that feature you, Kofi, because we know how much you love to talk about this stuff. So no worries at all. And just Kofi, just a quick time check. Are you okay if we stick around just a couple minutes over to answer a couple questions?
Yep. Yeah, I can say as long as I know you guys have a lot of things to do tonight, Eric, but as long as you guys, as much time as you guys have before your next commitment, I can make.
Okay, absolutely. That sounds great. Before I actually jump into the questions, Kofi, I just want to give a shout out to Jacob, who was the first to write Ronald Reagan. But we will say that many people were able to submit Ronald Reagan as their answer as well to that question that you had supplied. So we have a ton of smart people in this community. No surprise. So congrats, Jacob Doyle. We'll make sure that we reach out to you to make sure that you get this additional discount that Kofi mentioned.
Excellent. Congrats, Jacob.
Great. So we're at the time of the session, just a quick note to our audience, where Kofi will be answering your questions live. So we do have an area, a chat box area, where you can write in a question, and we'll do our best to filter through as many as possible over the next couple minutes. And if we can't reach it, there's a lot of ways you can reach out to Kofi actually through adminadvantage.com. Also, Admin Advantage has an active discussion forum called Ask Admin Advantage on the Beat2GMAT forums. So, Kofi, let's jump into the first question. This one's coming from a lot of people.
Okay.
Let me see if I can parse a question out of this. So, a lot of schools ask for recommendations from a current supervisor or boss. Can I get it from my former boss instead? I feel that my former boss actually knows me better. How can I do that if they specifically say, we need your boss to write a recommendation for you? So what are your thoughts about this? And in your situation where you'd like to use your former boss, but it seems like the school is pretty explicit about your current boss.
Right. Usually, so the answer is yes, you can use a former boss. Usually you have to explain why basically you're using a former boss as opposed to your current boss. Usually you can take the optional essay to explain that. Some schools actually tell you openly. Most schools will accept that, especially in this economy. A lot of people understand, a lot of admissions officers understand that if you tell them you're going to school, you might be applying to school in an unemployed state. So they get that. What I would say to you is that before, as opposed to using a former boss, there might be different things you can do. You could use someone who's in your current company who's superior to you, superior in the context of being ranked higher or sort of more advanced in your career, who has supervised you but is not your direct supervisor. So if you're working in finance, it may be an associate that maybe is an MBA alum that can write about seeing you on a deal, but that you don't directly report to. So there are different things that you can do beyond A, using your current boss, and B, using your former boss. It gets a little bit dicey too if your former boss is someone you haven't worked with for some time, and or if your former boss is not in the company, that it's kind of a judgment call. So you typically want to use somebody in your company if you can't use your direct boss, and if you are using someone who is your former boss that was in your company, that is no longer in your company, you don't want to use somebody who is you haven't worked with for a number of years, who hasn't been in your company for a number of years. Okay?
All right. Question coming in from Arnab. Arnab is asking, if my recommender doesn't have a good hold of English, will it be a good idea to write the recommendation for him? So tricky situation. What if you have someone that's not so great at English?
No, that happens. What I would say, Arnab, is that the command of English is not as important as how excited they are to write for you. So, I mean, I would caution you against writing your own recommendation. I mean, you have to understand these admissions officers are they're almost like forensic scientists, and they typically, I think they're smart enough to see that, in terms of your word structure, your sentence structure, your word choice, I think they can pretty much see through when you write your own recommendation. We don't advise that. And we have a number of candidates that always say, hey, I'm going to write my own recommendation. We strongly push back against that. Obviously, sometimes you have to do that. But I would be more concerned about making sure your recommender is effusive and heaps a lot of praise and says you're in the top 5 to 10%, as opposed to not doing that. Because oftentimes what we see, in Ghana, we see with a lot of our Asian candidates, we see with a lot of our European candidates, is there's some cultures where people, they're not necessarily as praised, they don't necessarily reap as much praise on people as they do potentially in the States. And so they're kind of reticent or a little bit more muted, and that can come through as not being excited about a person's candidacy. So that is something that you've got to look out for as opposed to the language. Don't worry if your recommender does not write like Hemingway. That's not really that important.
I got a follow-up question about that, Kofi. So I have to imagine, along with admissions officers being forensic scientists, the way that you put it, I really like that. They also are very culturally aware too. So I have to imagine that if they're seeing a recommendation coming from a candidate from a specific country, they may be a little bit more forgiving. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with that. I completely agree with that. And I think that falls, Eric, under the domain of, that also includes sort of leadership activities, right?
Yeah.
In terms of people from foreign countries. That's not to say that you're off the hook. Those of you listening from India or from Singapore, wherever you are, you still need to do leadership if you can. But they do understand that culturally it's a little bit different. That's true.
We're speaking with Kofi Kamkam. He's the co-founder of Admin Advantage, and he's taking your questions. So keep them coming. There's a lot of really great questions that we're seeing in the queue here. Next one's from Patrick. So Patrick is asking, other than coworkers and bosses, what type of other recommenders do individuals use?
Well, sometimes they use peers. So Stanford historically is asked for 3 recommendations, of which one of which is a peer recommendation. I don't suggest you use that unless you're specifically asked. People do use community people, so places where they may volunteer. So if you volunteer teaching science to kids, if you're volunteering doing something maybe more business oriented, like maybe teaching steps for financial success or getting out of credit card debt, etc., that kind of stuff, people will use executive directors in places where they volunteer. If you're working in if you're an entrepreneur, which is something a lot of entrepreneurs face, you may consider using a client, or probably maybe not a client, but maybe like a partner, like an accountant, or preferably somebody who's not necessarily making money off of you. That's hard to do. You don't want to use your parents if you're in the family-owned business, but people will use maybe suppliers. Suppliers are actually quite good to use, and maybe in some instances maybe a client, but you typically want to stay away from that.
Great. Another question for you, Kofi. This one is from a person initialed HR. So HR is asking, if you had to rank recommendations in the order of importance when considering all the items in the application, where would you rank it? So how heavily weighted are recommendations in the entire admissions package?
I would rank recommendations second. That's a good question. I've never had that question. I would certainly rank them second to essays. I would probably rank them second to essays and leave it there. The reason I'm ranking them second to essays as opposed to interviews is because a lot of times you're not going to get an interview unless you have a good set of essays, a good set of a resume and a non-essay data portion of your application, and a good set of recommendations. So I think they're very important because they are theoretically an objective analysis of your work history, an outsider perspective by someone that probably is older than you, a little bit more tenured, and has a little more context to understand your performance. So they are quite important. Unfortunately, like most things in this process, a bad recommendation it's much easier to sort of have a bad recommendation keep you out than have a great recommendation get you in. But they definitely are very important.
I really like this next question. This isn't from a specific person, but it's actually from a group of people. It seems, Kofi, that we're joined by a couple brothers and sisters in the entrepreneurial world. So shout out to you guys. Always great to meet entrepreneurs as well. And the general questions being asked are, who should entrepreneurs and founders of their own companies ask recommendation letters from?
Yeah, they should ask recommendations from basically potentially investors, potentially suppliers, potentially, I'm trying to think of the order, but definitely those two. I would say not employees, because if you're the CEO of a company, there's a problem with one of your employees. Obviously, they have a vested interest because they want to keep their job. So I'd probably say investors if you have outside investors. I would say suppliers/clients. I would say potentially service providers. So if you have a accountant you've been working with, or you have a lawyer you've been working with, those are the kinds of people that basically you want to write your recommendations. Those are also the kinds of people, typically investors and like service providers, who also have seen you in different instances in your company doing different deals in different levels of stress, dealing with sort of some real hurdles in your company. Those would be the top 2 places I'd look. I then would probably go to suppliers. Typically suppliers don't get a chance to get that kind of view of you, so that's why I'd probably stay with investors and or service providers, and potentially clients, but I'm just wary of that in the way that I am a little bit of employees. But I think that's where you have to turn.
Gotcha. So Kofi, I think we have time for just 2 more questions for this evening.
Okay.
So next question is from Angie. Angie is asking, this is a technical question, should recommendations be something we prepare for after we take the GMAT? What if we do not take the GMAT until September? So how do you juggle all this stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that's a little bit nuanced, Angie. What I would say is this. So if you are planning to, if you think you're going to do one on your GMAT, let's say it's June 19th. You think you're going to do one on your GMAT, you're trying to get your application out for round one, but you are not planning to take your GMAT until, let's say, August. You probably need to start talking to your recommenders now. You need to talk to them first. Ideally, you give yourself enough time where you take the GMAT first and then you go to your recommenders. And the reason why you typically want to follow that sequence, from my perspective, is because you may not do well on your GMAT, and your recommendation would be a really good point to shore up a weakness. So let's say, for example, you don't do well in the analytical portion of your GMAT. If you've done a lot of analytical projects in your job, if you're analyzing data all the time, that's a great place for a recommender to write about how you sort of are always sort of, synthesizing data, analyzing data, presenting it to seniors, being able to sort of make sense of the data when it's limited. They can write about your analytical prowess and to a certain extent buffer, at least partly buffer, a poor GMAT in a way that no other section of your application can do. And so if you had that person write the recommendation before you took your GMAT and then you did poorly on your GMAT, you'd lose that opportunity. So ideally, you want to do your GMAT first. I would say that if you're deciding between round one and round two, I probably would, to a certain extent, it's probably not good for a company, but I probably would really focus on your GMAT first. Get comfortable with the fact, either get your GMAT score or get comfortable with the fact that you're going to do well on your GMAT, and then get into all your stuff, because your GMAT score is really going to be quite important in terms of not just determining your recommendations, but also determining the schools that you're going to apply to. Like if you have a great GPA, as mentioned, you've got a poor GMAT, let's say you have a 3.4 GPA and you end up getting a 6.10 GMAT, your school list before may have been like, UVA, Michigan, Columbia, and let's say Wharton. You may only be able to apply to maybe two of those, and you may think about applying to less selective schools because your GMAT is not as strong. So your GMAT is pretty important.
Fantastic. So unfortunately, this is going to be the last question for this evening. Just one last reminder that Kofi and his team are available for a free consultation. You can see the SkedgeMe URL, http://sketch.me Admin Advantage right in front of you. Highly recommend that you reach out to them if we couldn't reach your question today. Additionally, Kofi and his team are active on Beat the GMAT, not only in our MBA Watch area, but also in their own Ask Admin Advantage forum. So they have a team there to address your questions. So this last question, again, is coming from many, many people. Very interesting situation. If you don't have a former boss, or if your former boss works at your current company, how do you ask for recommendations when you're worried that your supervisors will not be happy that you're applying to business school?
Right. So this is a personal discussion. So I think the first thing is you should know whether or not your supervisor has an MBA. Okay. Because a lot of times what we found is the official company perspective is we don't want this person, we don't want our analysts or our associates or people at a junior level getting an MBA. But if your boss has an MBA, he or she may understand your pursuit of an MBA. So you want to sort of ascertain that first. I think secondly, if you do not feel comfortable asking them, and I think as per some of the previous responses, I think that's when you need to look at again, if you can't get a former boss or you can't get a current boss, I think you need to look for people in your company that are superior to you, but you don't directly report to. Most of you that work in companies are interacting, either making reports or you're somehow involved in doing parts of a deal, etc., with people that are on your team. You're the junior part of a team. Now, you may have a person you directly report to. In fact, let's say you're an analyst on a team. You've got sort of an associate and you've got a VP. And let's say you report to the VP, theoretically. Let's say your associate reports to the VP as well. If your VP is not supportive of you getting an MBA, and if that person does not have an MBA, you may consider asking your associate, because your associate is above you. They may or may not have an MBA, but they've seen you in an instance where they've worked with you, they've seen you at a junior level, they can write about their experiences and your growth and your mistakes and how you compare to your peers, and they can give that perspective that your supervisor could give, but they're not your supervisor, and they probably will be more sympathetic. You may find they don't care, and that's kind of what you have to do. Otherwise, I mean, there's always an exception, but like that's kind of generally what you have to do, and everyone's in this position, so there's not that much you can do about that. If you have some specific questions on that, feel free to email me. Jacob, you should email me also, just generally for the discount, but I think that's kind of where you have to go.
And with that, I think we're going to have to end our session for this evening. We've been speaking to and hearing from Kofi Kankam, who is the co-founder of Admit Advantage. He walked us through his thoughts on the art of school fit and recommendations, and also spent some time to answer your questions directly. Kofi, as always, thank you so much for spending your evening with us to share some of the wisdom.
Can I say one quick thing, Eric?
Yes,
Eric,
please.
Can I say one quick thing? So can everybody write down ABL? A is in apple, B is in boy, L is in Larry. So ABL stands for anybody but LeBron. So most of you guys know I'm from Cleveland. I'm not going to ask you to pull for the Browns or my Cavs, but I am going to ask you guys to pull against Miami. So please pray for OKC tonight. That's all I ask. Thank you.
We have a really tremendous tradition here that I have no idea how this happened, but every single session that we have with Kofi has to end with Kofi pleading to our community to pray for or root for some sports team. So I was wondering what was missing, Kofi. I was like, what seems wrong about this session? Kofi didn't mention a sports team. Well,
yes, ABL for tonight.
Thank you so much for pulling through on that one. So vote for Oklahoma City, not the Heat, to win this one. I'll make Kofi proud. And to our audience members, thank you so much for joining us and joining us for this session. We'll have plenty more webinars featuring Kofi and his team in the future, so look forward to those throughout the admission season. And last but not least, just one more reminder, check out admitadvantage.com. Beat the GMAT also has an Admit Advantage page. If you go to admitadvantage.com/beatthegmat, you can check out the services and discounts are there. And I see that Kofi has changed his slides, so you can have a little bit more information about that 10% off discount, which is a fantastic deal. So thanks, guys, again, and enjoy the rest of your evening or morning, depending on where you are, and we hope to see you in a future event. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.